Kobby, thank you very much for joining me on this session where we're going to dive deep into your journey of becoming a web developer, an advocate, creating content, but also the company that you're working for, Cloudinary. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to chat.
Awesome. So first, I would start with an introduction of how I got to know you, and then you can um, take it on and take us throughout your journey. I think I came across your channel back in the days. You were producing a lot of Next.js and React content, a lot of cool content, and I've personally learned a ton from your content. You usually touch or teach stuff that nobody else was talking about, whether it was uploading images. I remember specifically a video that I saw from what you had done, or more recently the more components and libraries that you have created working with Cloudinary. So I first saw your content there. Then I kind of ran into you in the Next.js Conf, and I was like, oh, this is Kobby. I got to talk to this guy. Yeah, so I talked to you there. It was very nice. It was a very nice conference. I met a lot of people there, and you were one of the first people that I recognized. I was like, man, I have been following your content. I love your content.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So why don't you give us your journey into what happened, or when do you started programming?
Mm-hmm.
When did you become a web developer or an advocate? All the story.
Yeah. So my coding started in around high school, the serious coding, where I was building MySpace profiles and Counter-Strike team websites, and that was a lot of kind of just fun. I made a few bucks on the side making some MySpace profiles, but ultimately the interesting thing to me was how I could have this expressive language like CSS and HTML and completely transform a website with just a little bit of code, which was amazing to me. And then like the Counter-Strike team page, that was just for fun. Every time I would have like a little team, I'd spin up a website. It would just be the thing that I'd do. But ultimately that led to me kind of getting more serious about it and kind of self-taught how to code along the way, just out of interest. I actually went to school for design, so nothing related to coding. And through the years, I had a few different jobs. Worked for an e-commerce company, worked for a contracting company, doing UX design, front end engineering, where I did things like building satellite tasking dashboards and working for a family friendly video streaming service. And that ultimately led to me being interested in starting to teach some of the stuff that I was learning, particularly mapping when I first got into it. And, I started enjoying teaching more and more and helping people build their own stuff, trying to maximize my impact. And that led to developer advocacy, where eventually it led to where I am today, where it's still the kind of developer advocacy angle, but I particularly focus on code because that's what I'm most interested in. And that's kind of what landed me the developer experience.
Awesome. So when you said you studied for design, did you mean like UX and UI design, or design in the more traditional way of design?
Yeah, so at that point, it was graphic design. So a lot of like typography, layouting, and all that kind of stuff. And while I was doing website design on the side, like that was more of a hobby. And there's a lot of things that we're able to nicely translate between the two. And I remember, like at a certain point of time, people along in the circles of like CSS tricks and stuff, I know people were talking about how can we bring more graphic design to the web, which is amazing to see. But ultimately, like through the years, I started getting more interested in the UI design angle of that, and the specifically like UX design and how you're actually using that to solve problems, not just make something look nice, but like how is it going to actually solve somebody's problem to make it easier for them to do something and ultimately build a better product. And I kept exploring that more and more, and it's something I miss working on today. I try to scratch that itch when I can, but I loved that design angle of the web.
Yeah, it makes sense. It kind of is a nice transition or translation into front end development, where you can apply those ideas of design into now UIs or components that people can interact with. Now, when did React come into place? Have you, like in your journey of web dev, have you been working, like what came prior to React, or are you one of the early adopters of React?
Yeah, so prior to React, I was doing things like WordPress. I worked in a lot of PHP because one of the companies, the startups I was working for, was a PHP house. So I learned a lot through there, and it was an interesting learning path because I was able to kind of get a lot of the concepts from the more traditional server side approaches like MVC and such, and it was good for a learning experience of how I can apply that to a lot of the work I do today. But the first time I started playing with React was at a company called ThinkGeek, which is an e-commerce store, and I was developing the mobile checkout. It was maintained separately at the time, and I wanted something that was going to provide a very interactive and medium for me to build the checkout experience, and React was a good fit for that. Now, I ultimately didn't use it. I ended up using handlebars because I was kind of on my way out the door and I didn't want to drop some brand new framework on the team that nobody would know how to use. And that just didn't feel like a good fit there. So I ended up going with handlebars since a few people knew how to use it, and I did it kind of worked really well at that point. But when I started to get more serious into React was at that next job, that the contracting company that I was working with, where started to see how I can implement React into that video streaming site. I even looked at how I could use it to build a TV app, but that never took flight. It was more of a conceptual thing, and then eventually started building apps from scratch, like the satellite tasking dashboard. So it was a journey, and it was a fun journey, and I've had a lot of fun building really interesting apps from it.
Nice. I like it how you compared it to handlebars, because actually the first time that I came around React was back in the day in the context of templating language.
Yeah.
And you mentioned handlebars, and I was using something else. I don't remember what the name was, but uh, that was the first introduction into looking at React as a templating language, really, and then bringing some interactivity in the JavaScript instead of having to render this templating language once on the server and then again on the client. That just made it a little easier.
Yeah.
So interesting there. Now, in terms of React and Next.js, I consider myself one of the people who discovered Next.js early on, but I'm thinking that you uh, even exceeded me in that. You preceded me in that, because I remember back in the days when I was kind of dabbling into Next.js and documentation, I would see you already had content. So what drawn you into Next.js? Was it more like uh, SEO purposes and having some content in a React application, or was it the routing? So what is your journey of first starting with Next.js?
Yeah, so originally I was really into Gatsby. I think Gatsby was a great way to solve a lot of problems, but there was a little bit of a community riff, and at that point, I wanted to start playing around with other technology. Next.js was the up and coming option, so I gave it a try, and honestly didn't look back from there. I really enjoyed the user experience. I still really like the Pages router. I've been trying to use the app router as much as I can, but I still enjoy how the Pages router was developed and the experience, the developer experience around it. It was very intuitive and straightforward to me, and it made spinning up new apps just so easy. So I don't know. I just fell in love with it when I started playing around with it, and it just stuck.
It made sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of similar path for me, that when, going back to Gatsby for static site generation, which was back then the dominant player. If you wanted to have static sites using
Mm-hmm.
React, Gatsby was your go-to. And then Next.js came in with static site generation and server rendering, so dynamic and static together, and then had an API that makes sense, where you would have the file-based routing right there. You would have static site generation, and it was a no-brainer at that point.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the transition between Pages router and the app router. What do you what is what do you find difficult, if it is the mental model or the shift that you need to kind of get used to when using the app router? Is it that you want to write, I don't know, maybe animations, and it's not quite there with the app router? What is stopping you from the app router? Or a better question maybe is, what do you think of the app router, or this new change that's happening in Next.js, or even React with the server components and all this suspense and streaming that's just new to
Mhm.
React?
Yeah, so generally speaking, I think the app router is like a really great engineering feat. They did a really great job thinking about the entire story. Now, I think they've come a long way since they first released it, but I think the developer experience wasn't just quite there. And aside from all the like bugginess and whatnot, but I think they're making a lot of great improvements to that, like the caching story, for instance. But I still, the routing and like the file structure and stuff, it's just I'm used to it to the point where I'm completely productive in it, but I still kind of prefer the old pages router method. I use the router anytime I spin up an application, just because that's the future. I'm not going to. I want to make sure that I keep learning that as much as I can, and be able to apply that to my when I'm teaching Next.js. But I still miss the pages router a little bit.
Yeah, yeah,
But also like the way that the data was structured. Like I really like the concept of thinking about React components as a container that you pass the data into as props. I really like that mental model. And of course you can do that with things like higher order components, but it's still, it doesn't feel like that's the actual intent of a server component to be like that pattern. So while you can do it, it just having that data next to it in that separated way, to me, just felt a lot more intuitive. But
I see. Um, it makes sense. Thinking about React components as uh, just functions that render UI. You give them the data, they have internal state and interactivity, and they render
mhm.
data. It's separating the concern of where I'm fetching that data. It's just passing passing inside of a prop. The pages router with the get server side props and get static props had that mental model. You fetch the data on the server, pass it as a prop, done.
Yeah.
I hear you. Um,
And that's not to say that there's not compelling reasons to have like the inline fetches for a simple example inside of a server component. That makes it really powerful. And I think one of the powerful things is being able to have now shared server components. I think that there's a lot there. I just think that there's a little bit more that we can do to push that forward a little bit. And I think we're seeing some interesting things coming out of Remix land, for instance. And I still haven't played around with Remix myself, but looking at his Ryan's talk from React Conf, for instance, was pretty interesting. So that's one thing that I kind of want to explore down the line.
yeah. I mean, with the app router, from my standpoint or my experience, is in the beginning, it required a mental shift of the way that I was thinking about it, just like how you said it. But once I started using the app router, just being able to turn your server component into, because it's a function, it's an async function, you can fetch data, you can still pass props to client components in the same way that you would have just fetched it inside of a get server side props. It's just that it's now the React component itself that can do it.
Yeah.
It kind of made sense or clicked for me, and I didn't want it to go back to the pages router. So it's different how we're used to, the concepts that we're comfortable writing.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the fact that it enables me to have suspense, streaming, loading, error boundaries, just right with the addition of a file, I can now have all of those inside of each of my routes, or that I can easily create layouts natively, nested layouts. It was like bend backwards to create layouts in the pages router.
Right.
But a lot of a lot of use cases made it very easy to just build applications with the app router. And I'm like, I don't want to go back to the pages router. But
For
interesting.
sure. Yeah.
Now you mentioned React Conf. I think there was great talks there. Ryan's talk and also Dan Abramov's about the React server components for two computers. Because one thing that I think a lot of people struggle with in the context of Next.js, because Next.js had SSR before Now the
Yeah.
server components are like, okay, so then what is the server component? We had server-side rendering before in Next.js, so how is it different?
Right.
And him trying to explain it in the context of React, not even Next.js, just thinking about some of the work being done on the server in a different computer and then handing it off as a payload to the client component to continue, kind of made sense to me. I enjoyed that talk, and I think there's still, as you mentioned, more to do in terms of education and developer experience to make this new way of thinking about React and Next.js easier or more adaptable. But
Yeah.
we're still maybe in the beginning. It's interesting you mentioned that you like using Pages Router. I still see a lot of people and a lot of companies, they are still
Yeah.
using the Pages Router because this is a still cutting edge and it's going through iterations.
For
Um,
sure.
so a lot of people are still taking your approach of we're comfortable with the Pages
Yeah.
Router for now.
And to be clear, like everything that I've been building lately has been app router based. As much as I like it, I'm trying to continue to push myself to stay with the app router and keep pushing forward with that, learning the intricacies, how I can, build the experience that I think that I want out of an application with it. I think the one of the trickier things for me has been a lot of the like server to client communication, and that I don't think that story is completely finished yet in the app router, and I'm excited to see how they might tackle that in the future. Things like as simple as you fetch the data on the server and then pass it to the client. Do you immediately refresh, or refetch and like revalidating that data on the client as opposed to having to revalidate the server component, because there's different mechanisms that you'll want for fetching that data, right? So how can you create that comprehensive story between those boundaries?
Yeah, I think that's one of the major pain points of uh, getting used to this concept, and I think it's not even getting used to it, but it's still developing. As you mentioned, touched on it, the caching behavior is changing in Next.js 15 in that it's no longer static or cached by default
Yeah.
because there's different layers of data fetching and caching, and this synchronization needs to happen when you're fetching the data on the server, but maybe also mutating it on the client. And what needs to happen, there's 4 layers of caching, and some of which we didn't have in prior Next.js versions, like the router cache inside the browser, where it doesn't refetch the server component if it already has the server payload.
Yeah.
uh, Makes people confused of, okay, I expect this page to be dynamic, but it's not changing. What's going on?
Right.
What is the difference between a soft navigation or a hard reload? Why does it change when I refresh versus? So there's still a lot to kind of wrap around your head, and it is developing. So I think this caching thing that you just mentioned uh, is making a lot of people uncomfortable, and that's why they're
Yeah.
changing it in the next version.
And I appreciate like the engineering that's gone behind it, because caching is so incredibly complex. It's just you know unfortunately it's just became very confusing, not just for beginners, but a lot of senior devs are having issues. People who are experienced with those kind of things are having struggling a little bit. But I'm excited to see how they plan on even pushing forward more on that. But that's why for a while, things like Gatsby and stuff, we were kind of out of a luxury, I think, with the static pages, because you didn't have to think about caching as much with
Yeah.
static pages, right? So
Yeah.
while I think there's a lot of power to managing your responses with like the cache headers and stuff in a more responsible way, it's one more thing you have to think about.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because thinking about it, it was just way more simple. You would just
Yeah.
create your pages. It was a static pages. Everything else was handed off to the client side JavaScript. You want to fetch, you want to do whatever. That's it. I just am giving you some HTML and CSS from a CDN close to you, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
the browser go deal with it.
And like
It's in.
ISR on top of that, like
Yeah,
ISR was a beautiful thing. It's like
yeah,
if you want that extra dynamic layer without the full rebuilds, like you had the perfect mechanism for that.
exactly. Yeah, you're right. I never thought about it this way because it was way easier when the server wasn't in the
Right.
picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was like you run the build script, I'm done running anything on any server, hand off some static files, and let the client deal with it.
Yeah.
But I think it has enabled us. I mean, at the intersection of the introduction of AI, it's very
Mm.
interesting to me that React Server Components and streaming just came about the same time as these AI
Yeah.
things came, which just work fabulously if they're streaming data versus just a user waiting for 4 seconds until an LLM goes through a prediction.
It's funny. I never thought about that. Like that timing is pretty impeccable, right? I wonder if there was any kind of notion that, or maybe the way that AI kind of went was based off of what people kind of predicted. I don't know, but it's interesting. I wonder if there was some kind of correlation that maybe influenced
Yeah,
one way.
it just seems like highly correlated and
Yeah, yeah.
orchestrated, because by the time that we
It's a
had
conspiracy.
yeah, we had the Next.js 13 and the app router, it was just the beginning of the AI things. With this Vercel AI SDK, it's just so easy to spin
Yeah.
up an AI app. Now, talking about AI and AI apps, I did a video on Cloudinary using new features in Cloudinary for transforming images. I know you work in Cloudinary, so why don't we talk about Cloudinary in general and the new AI features, and take us in that journey of what you see behind the scenes of coming next into the landscape?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things with AI is, for me, it's hit or miss because there's so much kind of like fluff out there, adding chatbots to everything. But I'm really interested in some of the directions people are taking it. Like you mentioned the AI SDK, for instance, like there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that, with the, what is it called? The AI UI kit. I forget what the name for it is.
V0.
Yeah. And like and also the SDK that they're putting together, it's for people to build that experience, right?
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of compelling things with that. But one thing that people, I don't think too much about beyond generating images from scratch is how that can actually be incorporated to image and video workflows. And I'm not just saying this because I work at Cloudinary, but I think we're doing a lot of really interesting things. And what I think are the more compelling use cases are more of the workflow oriented features. So a few of the things that come to mind are like we can automatically generate captions for an image. We can automatically tag an image or video based off of the content. We could do moderation where we can detect if there's something, nudity or alcohol, if you want that out of your image or video. Like you can detect if those things are in the inside of the content, and then the automatic moderation will kick in, which is really helpful for things like user generated content, such as maybe you have an e-commerce store and you want people to submit user photos, right? And you don't want to have to go through yourself rejecting all these awful photos that people are submitting, but this is going to be something that can automate that work, right? Because I think the analysis angle of AI is a little bit more compelling than the generative, at least in my opinion, for what is more practically useful to people's everyday lives.
Yeah, that's a very interesting use case, and I remember even back in the days, Cloudinary before AI, it had pretty cool stuff inside of it. If like on the surface, it was just a CDN that you can use, but if you just explored beyond that, you would have just gotten transformations on the fly and auto tagging systems, and
Yeah,
now
yeah.
with this AI features, it's just amazing. I have a video on the channel where I build a full stack app transforming images with Cloudinary AI. So if anyone
Great
is
video.
interested, they can check it out. Also, your contents are amazing. In that
Thank
actually
you.
video, I'm using a library you created for called Next Cloudinary, which is specifically bringing Cloudinary APIs to Next.js apps. So we would
Yeah.
include links in the description for people to check it out. Do you want to talk about the library a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, I became a huge fan of Next.js. And when I started working at Cloudinary, one gap that they had was they didn't have any kind of Next.js specific SDKs. And at that time, and, of course, still today, you would see companies like Clerk who are creating this really great experience crafted directly to Next.js. It's not just a React SDK, it's a Next.js SDK. And I found that so compelling. So I wanted to try to do something similar. So what I ended up doing was extending the loader concept that Next.js image has. And I just created a wrapper component around Next image. And that's what it is still today, where I create a custom loader. I take in the different parameters that the Next image component passes through to that loader, including the width, the quality, the height, I believe, as well. And I pass those to construct Cloudinary URLs. But what I do on top of that is I can allow a whole bunch of different props on top of that are Cloudinary related. So those are all the transformations that you were talking about, such as removing a background or using some of the AI capabilities like removing an object from an image. But it's been able to, in my opinion, create a lot better experience of just making it as simple as possible to work where you are. And I think that's an important concept for building SDKs and developer products is people are really ingrained into the ecosystems that they're already in. So in this case, we're talking about Next.js. So trying to create a developer experience that caters to that ecosystem, I think is incredibly important in removing that friction and then just generally speaking, having developers, have a better experience with it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that was exactly my experience when I was using that your
Nice.
library or the components. I was like, when reading through the documentation from Cloudinary to know to understand the APIs of what needs to happen for these transformations was one thing, but then when came time for building, I just dropped the component in, pass a prop, and it was done.
Yeah, yeah.
It was so easy. So it's
That makes me
great.
happy to hear.
Yeah, awesome job there.
Yeah, and we've since expanded that to Nuxt and Svelte, and I'm hoping to add another framework onto that list this year. But time keeps escaping me, so we'll see how it goes.
Awesome. You mentioned other frameworks. Is there anything that in particular that you're playing around with or liking it?
I think Astro is the other one. I keep wanting to try to spend more time with things like Svelte and Nuxt, and every time I try to spin up a new application, it's like, do I really have time to spend doing this now? And while I should spend that time, I just always fall back to Next.js. So I do really want to spend some more time with frameworks. I have spent time with Astro. I think Astro is fantastic, and another one that I want to keep spending more time on. It's just that time. Uh, it never seems like I have extra time to spend on things like that. And,
Yeah,
hopefully soon that changes, but we'll see.
exactly. Astro is interesting. I haven't played around with it that much in terms of building, real applications with it. I have just started using it, but Svelte, I've actually used it and
Hmm.
build applications like e-commerce shops and real world projects with it, which is amazing. It's a slightly different than how you would think in React. It also had this concept of a compiler, which is now coming to React as well. But it's an interesting language in and of it itself. I think back in the days that I was using it, it was just version one that was just
Hmm.
going stable. So there was a lot of friction still to use Svelte as a full stack framework, but
Yeah.
it was interesting. It always, I think, from my personal experience, is that I think I still prefer React. I prefer Next.js, but using these other frameworks, it just allows me to build a more comprehensive
Hmm.
understanding of how these frameworks are working or how they're doing things differently. Sometimes it helps me in Next.js and in understanding what's going on in Next.js or React as well.
Yeah, totally. I love that idea. It helps you see, some of the more compelling things about how some of these frameworks solve different problems for different use cases, but also you can start to think about how you can apply some of those things you learn to the ecosystem that you use the most, such as Next.js. So I absolutely love that. And it's something that I've been meaning to do. I do want to spend more time, but I was talking earlier about Remix, for instance, and like the different loader patterns that they're getting into. And I'm excited to play around with things like that as well and see how maybe how that might make me rethink how I work with data inside
Yeah.
of Next.js, right?
Yeah, waiting for some remix content from your channel
Yeah, okay.
to
We'll see.
learn
Maybe
remix
I'll make a video just for you then.
video. Yeah. Of course. So, conferences and stuff. Do you do conference talks these days, or this is something for the past?
So this year, I absolutely slowed down on conference talks. I have been going to conferences. I'm going to be in Berlin for the We Are Developers World Congress, but this year I slowed down. I kind of overdid it the last couple of years. Just I when I give talks, I get a lot of anxiety and stress around it, so it's it beat me up a little bit. But I'm hoping maybe next year or I can start getting back into it because ultimately I do enjoy doing it. I enjoy going out there and teaching in person, meeting people and talking to them after
Yeah.
after the talks and everything. But
It's definitely a different experience. Now, from the perspective of an audience, when I went, the Next.js Conf that I actually met you there was the first time I actually went to an in-person Next.js
okay,
Conf. I've been doing it online, but like that was the first time I did it in person. And I had a fabulous time of meeting people. It just brought so much energy back to me to
yeah,
wanting to come back and do more. But I can imagine how nerve-wracking it could be if you're presenting.
yeah. Absolutely. I don't know how some people do it. And you
Yeah.
always see famous people saying they still get the nerves, right? But I don't know. But I do absolutely still love going to events. And but this year has been more so just as a sponsor with Cloudinary, or
Yeah.
just out of self-interest. And who knows? I'm hoping I get to go to like GitHub Universe this year, and I don't know if like Next.js Conf is going to happen at the end of the year like usual, but we'll see.
Yeah, it seems like as like probably the uh, last 2 weeks of October, somewhere in that time. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because probably at that time, Next.js 15 would be released, which is
Mm.
after React 19. So I'm expecting like a huge shift in React 19. And even though we're
Yeah.
using a lot of features from React 19, but it's funny you mentioned this because I have been thinking of this conference talks, and since I'm creating the content, I have been thinking of putting out a talk together, but
Mm.
it's just a whole different ball game. Now, even doing this, I've started, bringing guests to the channel and interviewing. Even this is sometimes nerve wracking because
Oh yeah.
it's different when you're creating a tutorial talking about what you know, rather than being a host now having to kind of conduct a meeting, ask questions, or welcome the guests. So it's
Right.
this even itself, it's nerve wracking, let alone talking to a lot of people. But I don't know, maybe I get some pointers from you. It is something that I want to put myself through. that
Yeah, yeah. No, and you're doing a fantastic job, by the way. And it certainly is, because it has that live aspect to it, and like you're a little bit extra pressure, but I think it's good. It creates more energy and excitement and everything. But from a talk perspective, one of the things that I really try to think about as I'm putting together talks is telling a story. So, trying to set up, I like to always have some kind of introduction that sets up context, not just as a here's a technical lecture. I want to tell a story about why this is going to be interesting to you. Why should you care about this? I remember some of the more compelling stories that I put together when I was talking about mapping technology, and I would talk about things like forest fires and hurricanes, and how those things are things that impact people's lives really greatly, and kind of then tying that into mapping technology, where scientists are actually using that to save lives, right? So being able to set up that context and then teach about the technology behind it, I thought was a nice arc. And then finally, some real life use cases about seeing that in action.
I love that. I love that idea, man. It. I'm not sure if I am creative enough to come up with this story, but I love that idea because those are the talks that I actually remember way longer, way after,
Yeah.
because of the story in how you bring in a concept or whatever it is that you're talking about into drawing the contrast or drawing some similarities into another experiment in a different area of life.
Yeah.
And usually Dan Abramov does that too. So,
Yeah.
or even the Ryan's talk. I listened to one of Ryan Florence's recent talks called Mind the Gap. I don't know what conference it was,
I
but
didn't catch that one.
that was a very nice talk. He starts from a renovation in his house, and then exactly as you just said, bring it to some like technical concepts.
Yeah.
So I will keep that in mind, like figuring out a story of what it is, what is the message that I want you to take away, and then what story would support that message. It's an
Yeah.
interesting, creative in and of it itself, and it's
For sure.
challenging, but I like the challenge.
And it's also like, the relatability, right? Like something that
Yes.
not is only going to make them care, but makes it feel relatable to
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. So definitely, I need to use your experience there. Um, I don't know. Maybe I would have a talk at next conf. You never know.
You got this. You got this.
Yeah. Okay, Kobe, this was awesome. Now, one last question I want to ask you before we go. We talked about tech, developer and your developer journey programming. What do you do when you're not coding?
um, you know, it's funny because coding is absolutely my hobby. So when I'm not working 9 to 5, I'm still coding. But aside from that, when I have time, I think mostly it's playing with my kid. My wife and I, and now my son, we love to travel. So we're going to be traveling up in July around Europe before the World Congress. So I'm excited about that. But aside from that, probably just everyday things, watching some fun movies, and
Yeah,
trying to hang around.
kids can occupy you more than enough to leave
Yes,
any
yes,
room for anything else.
yes.
Absolutely. Okay, awesome. It was very nice talking to you, Kobe. Thank you
Yeah,
very
it's been
much
a
for
pleasure.
taking the time to come here. We would include links to your channel. I don't think you need that links. People already know you, but for anyone who doesn't, check out Kobe's channel amazing content with
Thank you.
React, with new tools he's bringing in. I was just watching a video you did recently about notifications in Next.js application, which was great. So
Thank you.
definitely check him out. Pretty cool concepts and topics in his talks. I usually always learn something one way or another from your video. So I want to acknowledge you for that.
Really appreciate that. I'm happy to hear that.
Beautiful. Okay, so that was a wrap for this video. Folks, if you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.
See ya. Thanks.